The rain had a way of swallowing sound that night. It fell steady and relentless over the backroads of Thurston County, Washington, the kind of rain that blurred headlights into streaks and turned gravel ditches into shallow rivers. At 2:13 a.m., Deputy Harold Whitman eased his cruiser onto the shoulder of a narrow two-lane stretch, just outside Olympia. He'd been dispatched for what the caller described simply as something strange on the side of the road. At first, it seemed like nothing. A discarded torp, maybe. A deer. Whitman trained his flashlight across the ditch, the beam cutting through mist. That's when the outline took shape, unmistakably human. His breath caught. For a moment, the deputy stayed frozen, the rain pattering off the brim of his hat, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. He would later tell colleagues that he knew, even before he stepped closer, that this was not going to be another routine call. The young woman lay twisted, half submerged in the muddy water, one arm bent unnaturally beneath her. Her clothes clung to her body in the rain, her hair tangled across her face. But it wasn't just the sight of her that made Whitman's stomach tighten, it was the details. The way one shoe was missing. The absence of her purse. The faint marks on her wrist that seemed out of place. By the time backup arrived, word had already spread through the night shift radio chatter. Officers clustered at the scene, their voices hushed. It wasn't often that violence of this kind touched their quiet corner of Washington. Not like this. The coroner's van didn't pull away until nearly dawn. But the image of her body in that ditch would stay with the deputy, and, as it turned out, with the entire community, for decades to come. In the following days, newspapers gave her a name, but to her family she was never just a headline. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend who should have come home that night. In the small town, where everyone thought they knew each other, suspicion spread like wildfire. Whispers in diners, glances exchanged at gas stations. People wanted to believe this was random, a stranger passing through. But deep down, the fear was worse. What if the killer was one of their own? The investigation began with urgency, but even in those early hours, mistakes were made. Evidence was bagged sloppily. Witness statements conflicted. A footprint in the mud was photographed, then lost. Every clue seemed to raise more questions than answers. Who had she last spoken to? Why did her path take her down that lonely road? And why, in a case that seemed to touch so many, did no one step forward with the truth? Decades later, when investigators reopened the dusty case files, one deputy would describe flipping through the pages like peeling back layers of silence. The photos still bore the raw brutality of the night. The reports read like puzzle pieces that never quite fit together. But the most haunting detail was this. Tucked away in the evidence room, mislabeled and forgotten, sat an item that could change everything. What no one knew back in 1975 was that this small, overlooked piece of evidence, something that seemed meaningless at the time, would one day reopen the door to justice. And the question that haunted her family for nearly 50 years, who took her from us, would finally demand an answer. A body in a ditch on a rainy Washington night. A town forever scarred. And a mystery buried beneath decades of silence, until one forgotten clue surfaced to tell the story all over again. Her name was Linda Ray Thompson. 19 years old. A college freshman, barely stepping into adulthood, with a laugh that carried down hallways and a stubborn streak that both frustrated and undid her family. To the papers, she became the young woman found off Highway 101. But to those who knew her, she was light, energy, and potential, a life interrupted before it ever had the chance to fully take shape. Linda had grown up in Olympia, the youngest of 3 children. Her father worked long shifts at the local lumber mill, while her mother, a soft-spoken woman with a sharp wit, took part-time jobs to help make ends meet. Money was tight, but the Thompsons' home was full of warmth. Linda was the dreamer of the family. She taped concert posters across her bedroom walls, scribbled poetry in the margins of her notebooks, and insisted that one day she'd see the world outside Washington. She wanted to study art history, Paris, Florence, maybe even New York. To her, museums weren't just buildings, they were vaults of stories, proof that human lives left imprints long after death. Ironically, that was exactly what Linda herself would become. Friends described her as a mix of playful and fiercely loyal. One recalled, she was the kind of person who, if you told her a secret, she'd guard it like her life depended on it. But if you needed her to speak up for you, she'd be the first voice in the room. She wasn't naive, but she had that restless optimism of youth, the belief that the world, however flawed, had good waiting for her just around the corner. On the evening of October 10, 1975, Linda left a gathering at a friend's house. It wasn't a wild party, just a handful of classmates, records spinning in the background, someone passing around a bottle of cheap wine. She told her roommate she'd be home before midnight. It was the kind of promise young people made all the time, the kind parents trusted without worry. After all, Olympia in the mid-70s wasn't a place where danger lurked around every corner. It was small, familiar. People kept their doors unlocked. Strangers waved as they passed. But the world Linda believed in, safe, open, forgiving, would betray her that night. When her parents learned she hadn't returned home, panic set in quickly. Her father retraced her steps, calling friends, knocking on doors, driving the route she should have taken. Her mother, clutching the phone, called the police. By morning, rumors began circulating. Someone said they saw her talking with a man near a gas station. Another swore she had left in her own car. But as the hours stretched, the possibilities became darker. When Deputy Whitman found her body in that rain-filled ditch, the Thompsons' world collapsed. The officer's knock at their door was something her mother would describe, years later, as the moment everything went gray. In the weeks that followed, Linda's funeral drew hundreds. Students, neighbors, teachers, people who barely knew her but felt the loss deeply. In a small community, her death was more than tragedy, it was violation. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Her sister, Margaret, recalled. I remember sitting in my room after the funeral, staring at her posters, her records, her handwriting still in the margins of books. And I thought, how can she just be gone? How does a person just stop existing? That question became the echo at the center of the case. But Linda's death wasn't just personal grief, it rippled outward. Her friends changed colleges. Some left town entirely. Parents held their children closer. A quiet fear settled over Olympia, eroding the innocence of a place where people once believed things like this don't happen here. The stakes, from the very beginning, were more than solving a murder. They were about reclaiming a sense of safety, of justice, of truth. Every year that passed without an answer deepened the wound. And yet, even in absence, Linda refused to disappear. Her parents visited her grave on every birthday. Her mother wrote letters addressed to her daughter, tucked into a showbox no one else touched. Her sister named her first daughter after her. It was as though the community itself refused to let her memory fade, even as the case went cold. But here's the haunting part. While Linda's family kept her alive in memory, the evidence that could one day bring justice, evidence that sat in a mislabeled box for decades, waited silently, collecting dust. A necklace. A scrap of fabric. A single item investigators thought insignificant. The answers had been there all along. The tragedy wasn't only Linda's murder, it was that for nearly 50 years, the truth sat just out of reach. Linda Ray Thompson was more than a victim. She was a life full of promise. And for nearly 5 decades, her family carried the weight of unanswered questions. But in the end, her story would not remain unfinished. The days before Linda Ray Thompson's death seemed ordinary. That's what made it all the more chilling. October 7, 1975, 3 days before her body was found. Linda was spotted at the campus library, balancing a stack of textbooks and chatting with her friend, Amy Sanders. They were planning a weekend trip to Seattle to see a traveling art exhibit. Linda was excited. She'd even circled the date in her calendar. It would be her first time seeing original work she'd only studied in books. That evening, she returned home to her apartment, where her roommate remembered her humming as she cooked pasta on the stove. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. October 8th. Linda spent the day in class and later called her mother, asking if her younger brother could send along a jacket she'd forgotten. It was a short conversation, but her mother later replayed every word, searching for clues. October 9th. She attended a late study session. One classmate recalled how she seemed distracted, staring at the clock more than usual. When asked about it, Linda brushed it off, saying she had something on her mind. Nobody thought much of it at the time. But it was October 10, 1975, the night everything changed, that investigators would later pick apart hour by hour. At 6:30 p.m., Linda stopped by a friend's apartment on the east side of town. A small gathering, no more than 8 people, most of them fellow students. Someone played Fleetwood Mac on the turntable. A cheap bottle of red wine made its way around the room. Friends remembered her laughing, animated, telling a story about a professor who mispronounced her last name in class. Around 10:45 p.m., she mentioned heading home. Her roommate expected her by midnight. Several witnesses confirmed she left the apartment between 11 o'clock and 11:15. She wore a denim jacket, dark slacks, and a pair of leather boots. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. What happened in the 90 minutes between her departure and the discovery of her body has remained the central mystery for decades. At 11:30 p.m., a gas station attendant near Capitol Way recalled seeing a young woman matching Linda's description speaking with a man in a dark-colored vehicle, possibly a Chevrolet Impala. The attendant couldn't recall the man's face clearly, only that he was older, maybe mid-30s, and that he seemed persistent. Linda appeared uneasy. At 11:45 p.m., another potential sighting surfaced. A couple driving home from a late dinner reported seeing a figure walking along the shoulder of Highway 101. The description was vague, but the timing matched. By 12 a.m., her roommate grew worried. She'd promised to be home. Calls to her friends went unanswered. What came next would become part of Olympia's folklore: contradictory statements, fleeting glimpses, and fragments of truth that never fully aligned. One neighbor swore he saw Linda's car parked outside an unfamiliar house near the edge of town. Another insisted she had been seen climbing into a truck. But the police could never confirm either. What they did know was this: sometime between 11:15 and 1:30 a.m., Linda encountered someone who altered her path forever. And then there were the strange details. When her body was found, her left boot was missing. Investigators scoured the roadside ditches for miles, but it was never recovered. Some suggested the killer had taken it as a trophy. Others wondered if she had been forced to walk barefoot, a cruel attempt to disorient her before the end. Her purse, too, was gone. Inside would have been her student ID, some loose cash, and a notebook she carried everywhere. None of it was ever found. These missing items were the first clues, or distractions, in a case that would confound detectives. The following morning, as news spread, speculation gripped the community. Some pointed to a drifter seen hanging around bus stations. Others whispered about a jealous ex-boyfriend. A few even suggested someone from within law enforcement itself. The lack of clarity only deepened the unease. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. College students formed informal buddy systems. But the questions never stopped. Why did she leave the gathering when she did? Who was the man at the gas station? And why, on a road she should have traveled safely, did her life end in such violence? In hindsight, the timeline reads like a collection of missed opportunities. Witnesses who noticed something odd but didn't speak up until weeks later. Evidence that slipped through cracks. Moments where, had just one person intervened, the story might have ended differently. But history is cruel. The clock cannot be turned back. All that remains are fragments that investigators would revisit decades later, armed with new tools, searching for patterns invisible in 1975. The timeline of Linda Ray Thompson's final hours is less a straight line than a jagged puzzle. Every account contradicts another. Every sighting opens new questions. And in that uncertainty, her killer found shelter, for nearly half a century. The call came in just after 2 in the morning. A motorist, driving along a desolate stretch of Highway 101, reported what looked like a bundle of clothing in the roadside ditch. At first, dispatch treated it as routine, maybe debris washed down by the rain, or a deer struck by a passing truck. But when Deputy Harold Whitman arrived, flashlight in hand, the beam caught something no one was prepared to see. Linda Ray Thompson. Her body was partially submerged in rainwater, her hair matted against her pale face. The position was unnatural, as though she'd been dropped, not fallen. One arm was tucked awkwardly beneath her, the other extended outward, fingers curled. Her jacket was torn along the sleeve, and the mud had already begun to cake the fabric. Whitman's voice on the radio was steady, but those who listened swore they could hear the tremor underneath. Microphone hash: "I've got a body. Female. Send the coroner." When backup arrived, headlights washed over the scene in harsh beams. Officers moved cautiously, boots sinking into the soggy ground. They noted the details that would later become critical. Her purse was missing. Her left boot was gone. There were faint bruises around her wrists, suggesting restraint. Her face bore scratches, defensive wounds, perhaps. The immediate impression was grim: Linda had fought. The coroner arrived close to dawn, his breath visible in the cold air. He crouched beside her, studying the body as rain continued to fall. Time of death was estimated to be within the past 4 hours, meaning Linda had likely still been alive when her roommate began worrying at midnight. A crowd of curious onlookers gathered by sunrise. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and people stood at the roadside, clutching umbrellas, whispering theories. To them, this was more than a crime scene. It was a rupture in their sense of safety. Investigators combed the area, but their efforts were hindered by the relentless rain. Potential footprints dissolved in the mud. Tire tracks blurred. A cigarette butt found a few feet away was bagged, but with 1975's technology, it offered no immediate answers. Still, there were oddities. Her body was found just 20 yards off the road, far enough to suggest she hadn't simply collapsed while walking, but not so far as to appear deliberately hidden. Whoever left her there hadn't cared to conceal the crime. Was it arrogance? Or panic? And then there was the boot. Investigators searched for hours, fanning out through the brush, but it was gone. Some believed the killer had taken it. Others thought it had been lost in a struggle elsewhere. Either way, it was the first missing piece of a puzzle that seemed to expand with every detail uncovered. At 9 a.m., as her body was transported to the morgue, sheriff's deputies knocked on the Thompson family's door. Her mother collapsed upon hearing the news. Her father's silence was described as the kind that filled the whole room. Her sister, Margaret, later recalled the sound of her mother's scream as something that never left her. Microphone hash, it was like the world split open. That's how I knew nothing would ever be the same. The autopsy began later that afternoon. Dr. Henry Wallace, Thurston County's medical examiner, worked quietly, meticulously. What he found would deepen the mystery. Linda's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, a single, devastating blow. But there were other injuries: bruising on her wrists consistent with binding, scratches on her arms that matched defensive wounds, and faint impressions across her neck suggesting an attempt at strangulation. The combination baffled investigators. If the killer had intended strangulation, why the blunt force trauma? If the blow to the head was fatal, why the restraint? It raised questions about intent. Was this a planned act of violence, or something that escalated chaotically? Toxicology came back negative. Linda had no drugs or alcohol in her system aside from trace amounts of wine from the gathering earlier that night. Whatever happened, she was fully aware, fully conscious, when it began. But it was one final detail that shook detectives most: fibers found beneath her fingernails. They didn't match her clothing. They suggested she had clawed at someone in her final moments. Evidence of a struggle, evidence that might have identified her killer, had forensic science of the 1970s been able to decode it. Instead, the samples were placed into small envelopes, sealed, and stored. By evening, Olympia buzzed with rumor. Neighbors whispered about strange men spotted around town. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Students skipped classes, too shaken to concentrate. A sense of fear seeped into the community, tightening like fog. The police, meanwhile, scrambled. The sheriff's department interviewed motorists, combed through Linda's last known movements, and questioned friends. They hoped for a quick resolution. But already, contradictions emerged. Witnesses disagreed about the man at the gas station. Some said Linda looked calm, others swore she appeared nervous. And no one could confirm where she went after 11:15 that night. What had begun as a hopeful sprint toward justice slowed to a crawl of confusion. By the end of that first week, detectives had a list of potential suspects. None seemed to fit perfectly, but all carried shadows of possibility. A young man Linda had briefly dated the previous spring. A transient spotted near the highway days before. A family acquaintance with a reputation for temper. Each name carried weight, each theory sparked heated debate. But evidence was scarce, and the clock was already ticking. And so the crime scene, once alive with flashing lights and urgent voices, faded into memory. Cars sped past that stretch of road again, commuters returning to routine. But for Linda's family, and for the investigators who had looked down into that ditch, there was no return to normal. The autopsy revealed brutality, but not clarity. The evidence raised questions, but not answers. And the fibers under Linda's fingernails, the silent testimony of her final fight, would remain mute for decades, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. The scene was rich with evidence, but poor in answers. The missing boot, the vanished purse, the fibers beneath her nails, all pointed toward a struggle. But in 1975, they pointed nowhere specific. And so, almost from the beginning, Linda's case teetered on the edge of becoming what no family ever wants to hear: a cold case. In December of 1976, the quiet town of LaGrange, Georgia, found itself at the center of a mystery that no one could unravel. When 22-year-old Kyle Clinkscales vanished on his way back to Auburn University, police mobilized quickly. A missing person was one thing. But a missing young man with no history of trouble, no enemies, no reason to run? That was something else entirely. Detectives scoured the highways between LaGrange and Auburn, focusing on the lonely stretch of country road Kyle was last seen driving down in his white 1974 Pinto runabout. They retraced every mile. But no broken glass, no skid marks, no sign of an accident appeared. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The forensic wall of the 1970s. Today, an investigator could take a strand of hair, a scrap of fabric, or even dust from the floorboards of a car and pull a DNA profile that might crack the case wide open. But in 1976? That was science fiction. Back then, investigators worked with fingerprints, ballistics, and witness testimony, and that was it. If a body wasn't found, if a crime scene wasn't obvious, detectives were left with little more than instinct. In Kyle's case, there was no crime scene. No body. No car. Just the memory of his parents waving goodbye that night, and the vague recollections of people who thought they might have seen his Pinto on the road. Without physical evidence, every lead came down to human memory, and memory, especially in small-town rumor mills, was fragile, contradictory, and often wrong. Chasing shadows. The early weeks of the investigation saw detectives working around the clock. Deputies fanned out, interviewing everyone at the Moose Club where Kyle worked as a bartender. They asked his co-workers, had Kyle seemed nervous? Had he mentioned trouble? Did anyone follow him that night? The answers only deepened the fog. Some swore Kyle was in high spirits, talking about finishing his degree at Auburn. Others remembered him quieter than usual, distracted, maybe even worried. A few claimed they saw him argue with a stranger at the bar days before. Then came the flood of rumors. Someone thought they saw Kyle's Pinto heading south on the highway toward Alabama. Another insisted he'd been spotted at a gas station in Columbus, talking to two rough-looking men. Yet another swore they saw his car pulled over near West Point Lake, headlights still on. Each tip sent detectives scrambling, only to end in frustration. The gas station clerk couldn't recall Kyle at all. The supposed sighting near the lake turned out to be a different car. And the theory that Kyle had just run off? It didn't match the man his family and friends knew. Every day, the case seemed to expand in 10 directions, and none of them led to the truth. Suspects and theories. With so little evidence, police leaned on possibilities. Was Kyle kidnapped? Did he stumble onto something he shouldn't have? Was he caught up in trouble he kept hidden from his family? One theory pointed to a robbery gone wrong. Kyle had worked late nights at the Moose Club, handling cash, often driving home with money in his pocket. Had someone followed him, looking to make a quick score? Another theory dug darker, whispers that Kyle had gotten entangled with drug dealers moving product through rural Georgia. But those whispers never solidified into proof. Detectives interviewed known troublemakers in town. They leaned on petty criminals, trying to squeeze out any connection to Kyle's disappearance. Some names were floated, but with no body, no car, and no witnesses willing to risk themselves, the case stalled. The weight of contradictions. For the Clinkscales family, the contradictions were unbearable. One day, a tip would suggest Kyle was alive somewhere, starting over. The next, rumors of murder would swirl. Each lead gave his parents a sliver of hope or a punch to the gut. The community, too, began to fracture under the paranoia. In a small town, everyone looks over their shoulder when a young man vanishes without a trace. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Friends eyed each other with suspicion. Every unsolved crime breeds its own mythology, and in LaGrange, Kyle's disappearance became exactly that. The case slips away. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. Detectives who once chased the case with energy and urgency found themselves staring at empty files. The investigation had no anchor. Without the Pinto, without Kyle, they had nothing to hold on to. Search parties dwindled. Leads dried up. Witness memories faded. By the early 1980s, the case was little more than an open file gathering dust on a shelf. But for Louise and John Clinkscales, Kyle's parents, the search never ended. His mother drove the highways for years, scanning every ditch, every patch of woods, every body of water, looking for a glimpse of white metal, a cracked windshield, a son she would never see again. In the end, the 1970s failed Kyle the way it failed so many families of the missing. The science wasn't there. The tools weren't there. All they had was a boy gone missing, a car that never appeared, and the cold silence of Georgia backroads at night. The investigation had started with urgency, with hope. But by the time the decade closed, it had slipped into the shadows, where it would remain for decades. The years dragged on, and with each season that passed, the name Kyle Clinkscales slipped a little further from the public's lips, but never from the hearts of those who loved him. For John and Louise, Kyle's parents, every morning began with the same hollow ritual. John would step onto the porch, scan the horizon as if his son might suddenly appear on the dirt road that led to their small home in LaGrange. Louise would hover by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, whispering prayers to a God who had grown silent. The police still claimed to be working the case. But behind closed doors, they admitted the truth. Without a body, without a crime scene, they were searching blind. Families breaking down. Louise kept Kyle's room untouched, auburn pennants on the wall, his college textbooks stacked neatly by the bed, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. She told friends it gave her comfort, but in truth, it was a shrine. A room frozen in time. A room that made the absence louder. John coped differently. He drove the highways at night, convinced that if he retraced the same path Kyle would have taken that December evening, he might spot something, a clue missed, a sign overlooked. More than once, neighbors would find his truck parked on some lonely back road, headlights burning into the dark, while John sat inside gripping the steering wheel with tears in his eyes. The strain hollowed their marriage. Conversations grew short, dinners went cold, and eventually silence became the loudest sound in the house. They weren't just grieving their son. They were grieving each other, too. Investigators haunted by failure. Detectives who had sworn they'd cracked this case slowly moved on. Some transferred to other departments. Some retired. But not one of them forgot the Clinkscales family. One former investigator confessed years later that Kyle's disappearance became the ghost that followed him into retirement. He admitted he still saw Kyle's face in his sleep, the boy with dreams bigger than a small town could hold, swallowed whole by mystery. The limitations of the 1970s haunted them, too. They didn't have DNA databases. No cell phone pings. No surveillance cameras on every corner. They had memories, unreliable, fading, and often poisoned by rumor. And there were so many rumors. Kyle had run off to start a new life. Kyle had crossed the wrong people. Kyle had been silenced because he knew too much. Every whisper twisted the knife deeper into his parents' wounds. And detectives, desperate for leads, chased nearly all of them, burning hours, months, years, only to circle back with empty hands. Contradictions and paranoia. The community of La Grange grew restless. In a small town, whispers travel faster than facts. One man swore he saw Kyle's Pinto near the Alabama line days after he vanished. Another woman claimed Kyle had confided in her about trouble at the bar where he worked. Every lead contradicted the last, leaving investigators paralyzed between possibilities. Paranoia seeped into daily life. Families locked their doors earlier. Teenagers traded cautionary tales about what happened to Kyle. Bartenders poured drinks to nervous locals who swore they knew something but never had the courage to go to police. And still, nothing. The case file thickened with reports, transcripts, false starts. A tower of paper with no spine, no center. The toll on Louise and John. By the late 1980s, a decade after Kyle's disappearance, Louise had grown frail. The grief etched itself into her face, stole the color from her cheeks, and left her moving like a shadow through her own life. She stopped attending church regularly, not because she lost faith, but because the sympathetic glances from her neighbors became unbearable. To her, every look carried a hidden accusation. Why can't you move on? John hardened in the opposite way. He became louder, more confrontational, cornering sheriffs and detectives at grocery stores, demanding updates they couldn't give. He was described as angry, but beneath that anger was a desperate father clawing at the edges of a void no one could fill. The marriage, once bound by laughter and dreams for their only son, now hung by a thread of shared grief. They stayed together, but the warmth between them faded into ritual, cooking, cleaning, sleeping in the same house, yet worlds apart. Investigators retiring with guilt. The cold case squad in La Grange dwindled. Detectives retired, some moving away, others burying themselves in different lives. But the name Clinkscales never left them. One investigator admitted privately that he used to drive past Kyle's old haunts, the bar where he worked, the roads he traveled, and whisper apologies into the night. Apologies for not finding him. Apologies for leaving his family in limbo. Another kept a newspaper clipping of Kyle's missing poster tucked inside his wallet, long after he left the force. A reminder of unfinished business. A scar carried in silence. Dramatic irony, hints missed. And here is where the cruelest twist of fate lies, in the details that hindsight later revealed. Witnesses had mentioned seeing a small, dark car near a creek bed off County Road 83. Police had checked the area briefly, then moved on. Locals whispered about suspicious men at the Moose Club the night Kyle vanished, but the lead never turned into evidence. One deputy even speculated aloud, maybe he drove into water. But without hard proof, the theory was shelved, just one possibility among dozens. The audience knows now what the police could not, that Kyle's Pinto, with his remains inside, sat hidden in the mud of a creek for decades. That the water concealed what eyes, dogs, and manhunts could not find. It was there all along. Hope turned to silence. By the 1990s, Kyle's disappearance had faded from the headlines. New crimes stole the front page. New families carried their own grief. But for the Clinkscales family, the silence never ended. Each holiday was a reminder of the empty chair at the table. Each birthday a reminder of the future stolen from them. Louise once said in an interview, her voice barely above a whisper, "The not knowing is the worst. If he's alive, I want to see him. If he's gone, I want to bury him. I just want to know." But the years kept rolling, mercilessly. And answers never came. The weight of time. 2 decades turned into 3. Then 4. Investigators came and went. Family members aged, weakened, passed on. But the hole left by Kyle's disappearance never healed. What began as an urgent manhunt had decayed into a ghost story, a case no one could close, a wound no one could stitch. And in that absence, in that silence, lived the true cruelty of this cold case. By the early 1980s, Kyle Clinkscales' disappearance had moved from the front page of the LaGrange Daily News to the back corners of barbershop conversations, whispered church gossip, and late-night stories teenagers told to spook each other. The case was never officially solved, but unofficially, everybody had a theory. Everybody had a story. And some swore they had seen something. The ghost on County Road 83. It started with the kids. In small towns, when a tragedy lingers too long, it stops feeling like crime and starts feeling like folklore. On warm summer nights, teenagers would drive down County Road 83, the stretch of highway Kyle was supposed to take to Auburn, and dare each other to stop. "Cut the headlights," one kid would whisper. "Wait for it," another would say, holding their breath. And then came the legend. If you parked there long enough, you'd see the ghost of a young man thumbing for a ride, a college kid in a faded Auburn shirt, jeans worn at the knees, his hand forever frozen mid-wave. Some swore they saw him. Others swore they heard him, a faint knock on the side of their car, like a desperate hitchhiker begging to be let in. But when the braver ones stepped out, flashlights in hand, nothing but the chorus of crickets and the sigh of Georgia pines. To the teenagers of LaGrange, Kyle became a ghost story. To their parents, that was almost worse than the crime itself. Rumors of cover-ups. But in the adult conversations, the myths took on darker shades. Some whispered that Kyle had been killed by someone powerful, a sheriff's son, a wealthy landowner, somebody with pull. The lack of answers wasn't incompetence, they argued. It was a cover-up. The taverns buzzed with talk. Too many folks got money tied up in keeping quiet. They knew who did it. They just didn't want to touch him. And when the case dragged on for years without progress, those whispers hardened into belief. For some, Kyle wasn't just a missing boy. He was proof that in LaGrange, justice didn't come for everyone equally. The bootlegger theory. Then there was the bootlegger theory. LaGrange sat on backroads that had always carried secrets, moonshine during Prohibition, weed and cocaine in the 70s. Some believed Kyle stumbled into the wrong crowd that night, maybe stopped at the wrong bar, maybe said the wrong thing. "Boy probably saw something he wasn't supposed to see," one old-timer muttered. And just like that, the theory of an innocent college kid turned into the legend of a witness silenced. The lovers' quarrel. But the cruelest rumor of all came from the whispers about Kyle's love life. Some claimed he had been secretly dating someone in town, someone who couldn't be seen with him publicly. A married woman. A girl with a jealous boyfriend. Maybe even someone tied to the sheriff's office. The theory went like this: he left Skeeter's bar that night not to head straight to Auburn, but to meet her. A meeting that turned deadly. There was no evidence. No police report. No name attached. But rumors didn't need proof. They needed pain. And every time the Clinkscales family heard those whispers, it cut deeper than the silence. How folklore kept him alive. As years passed, the investigation files gathered dust, but the stories didn't. Kids who hadn't even been born in 1976 grew up hearing about Kyle. His name was etched into the local consciousness like an unfinished sentence. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was the spirit on the highway. The victim of a sheriff's cover-up. The college dreamer who never made it home. The myths did something strange. They kept him alive. People who had never met Kyle still felt like they knew him, because they carried the legends of his disappearance like family heirlooms. But for the Clinkscales family, and for the detectives who had poured their hearts into the case, it was a bitter reminder. Folklore was a way of saying, we've given up on truth. All we have left are stories. The shadow that never left LaGrange. By the 1990s, LaGrange had changed. The mills closed. New highways carved paths through old farmland. Families moved away. But whenever a stranger asked about the town, someone always leaned in with the same answer. You ever hear about that boy who vanished? The one they never found. And in the silence that followed, the weight of 20 years pressed down like it had just happened yesterday. Kyle Clinkscales was gone, but his shadow never left LaGrange. It haunted the teenagers who whispered his name. It fueled the cynics who believed in cover-ups. It lived in the rumors of affairs, bootleggers, and restless ghosts. The police had filed it away as an unsolved case. But to the people of LaGrange, it was a story too heavy to let go of, too strange, too tragic, too unfinished. And for decades, the legend of Kyle Clinkscales would hang in the air like Georgia humidity, thick, unshakable, and inescapable. Because in towns like this, unsolved cases don't just fade. They turn into folklore. And folklore never dies. For decades, Kyle Clinkscales' name had lived in whispers. His story was folded into barroom tales, family prayers, and late-night dares among kids who weren't even alive when he disappeared. The official investigation had gone cold long ago. Files were packed up, boxed, stacked, and left to age like dust-heavy tombstones in the back corners of storage rooms nobody visited. But fate has a way of circling back. It didn't happen with fanfare. No big press conference. No dramatic tip-off from a mysterious stranger. Instead, it started with something mundane. A deputy in LaGrange, newly transferred to records, was doing inventory. The year was in the late 2000s. Paper records were being digitized. The sheriff's office was clearing out basements, closets, and file rooms. Boxes that had been shuffled from one office to another for 30 years were finally being opened, catalogued, and, in many cases, tossed. One such box sat at the bottom of a leaning stack, its edges yellowed, tape crumbling. On the label, barely legible in faded ink, were the words, Clinkscales, K, property. At first, the deputy didn't think much of it. Old cases, especially cold ones, had a way of multiplying, duplicate files, exhibits that should have been returned, pieces of evidence that slipped through cracks. Most times, they were nothing more than faded photos or broken chains of custody that couldn't stand in court anymore. But when the box was opened, it felt like someone had split open a time capsule. Inside were items that shouldn't have been forgotten. A few Polaroids, sealed bags with scraps of fabric, soil samples, a handwritten map noting the area where Kyle was last reportedly seen. And then, at the bottom, a small envelope marked unprocessed. That word carried weight. It meant whatever was inside had never been properly tested. Never run through the latest science. Never given its fair chance to speak. Back in the 1970s, forensic science was blunt, primitive. Investigators relied on fingerprints, shoe impressions, tire tracks, and, most of all, memory. Eyewitnesses ruled the day, even when memory faltered. DNA wasn't even a dream in a scientist's mind yet. Trace evidence was often bagged but rarely useful. But now? In the modern era, a fragment of bone, a single hair, a drop of blood invisible to the eye, they could all tell stories louder than any living witness. When the deputy flagged the find to his superior, it set off a chain reaction. At first, the older investigators shrugged. After all, they had seen this before. Cold cases eat boxes for breakfast, one of them muttered. You open them, you just find dead ends all over again. But curiosity is stubborn. A younger detective, new to the force but fascinated by the Clinkscales case, insisted on taking a closer look. He knew the legend. He'd grown up hearing whispers of the missing Auburn student whose car had vanished like smoke. To him, this wasn't just another file, it was the file. The ghost that haunted his county. So he spread out the contents on a metal desk, each item laid bare under fluorescent light. What had once been evidence sealed by 1970s hands now looked fragile, even holy. And here's where the dramatic irony cuts sharp. We, the audience, know what those tired, skeptical detectives didn't. That within these scraps, buried in dust, could be the very clues that decades of blood, sweat, and searching had missed. We feel the tension before they do. We know science has leapt ahead while their doubt keeps them tethered to the past. At first, the items seemed ordinary. A fragment of metal. Some fibers. Dirt in a sealed vial. But then, the detective noticed it, a piece of material that looked almost like it had been burned. He held it up, tilting it in the light. What exactly had it come from? A car seat? A shirt? The question echoed. The box, forgotten for years, suddenly became a weight on the whole department. Should they test it? Should they risk disappointment? The sheriff at the time was cautious. Resources were thin. DNA testing was expensive, often taking months, sometimes years to process. And what if the samples had degraded too far? But the detective pressed. He made his case with passion. We owe it to him. We owe it to his family. Even if it goes nowhere, at least we'll know we didn't leave him buried in paperwork. Those words landed. And so, reluctantly, the sheriff's office approved the transfer. The evidence was packaged again, this time with all the care and precision the 1970s had lacked, and sent to the state crime lab. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The Clinkscales case, long dismissed as folklore, now had breath again. In the sheriff's office halls, deputies whispered. In town, rumors sparked. Was it true? Were they reopening the case? Could this really mean answers after 30 years of silence? And then came the moment every investigator both fears and craves, the call from the lab. The samples, they said, were viable. Technology had managed to pull profiles, trace chemical signatures, and yield data that was unimaginable in 1976. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. What had once been nothing more than rumors, theories, and wild speculation was now tethered to science. Hard, cold, undeniable science. For the family of Kyle Clinkscales, now older, wearier, and scattered, this moment was a gut punch. 4 years, they had begged for answers, haunted by the not knowing. Now, decades later, the possibility of truth dangled before them again. But with hope comes fear. What if the evidence revealed something too dark to bear? What if the answers weren't answers at all, but new wounds? And for investigators, especially those who had chased leads in the 70s and 80s, this moment carried guilt. Because inside that box was proof of something they had overlooked, or perhaps mishandled. It was as if the case itself had been whispering all along, I was here. You just didn't see me. The box wasn't just a box. It was a mirror. And staring back were decades of failure, decades of silence, decades of opportunity lost. Yet, at the same time, it was also a door. And for the first time in 30 years, that door was creaking open. Time is supposed to bury secrets. But when the past is unearthed, it doesn't whisper, it roars back to life. The year was no longer 1976. The polyester suits, the rotary phones, the flickering diner neon, all of that belonged to a different America. Now it was decades later, and detectives were staring at old crime scene photos, yellowed reports, and a box of evidence that time had almost devoured. But the difference was this: science had caught up. What once was guesswork could now be dissected under the cold precision of forensics. The reopening of Kyle Clinkscales' case didn't happen with fireworks or headlines at first. It started quietly, just a task force assignment. A couple of seasoned detectives and analysts were told, see if anything in here is worth pursuing. If not, close it for good. But the moment they began flipping through the old files, something strange happened. The voices of 1976, handwritten witness statements, police sketches, faded maps, came alive again. Back to LaGrange, a different town, same wound. The investigators started by retracing the steps of their predecessors. LaGrange had changed. New businesses, new faces, a new generation that only knew Kyle's name as a ghost story. But for the people who had lived through it, reopening the case felt like tearing the scab off an old wound. They knocked on doors that had been closed for decades. Some witnesses were still alive, older now, frail, but carrying memories like scars. They weren't just reopening an investigation. They were reopening grief. The witnesses who never forgot. The bartender's colleagues, they remembered Kyle working his shift the night he disappeared. One recalled the way he wiped down the bar extra carefully, almost as if he knew it would be his last night there. Another swore Kyle mentioned he had plans, something about heading back to Auburn. The friends at the club, aging now, they admitted under new questioning that they hadn't been entirely truthful in 1976. Back then, protecting each other was instinct. But time wears down loyalties. One man finally confessed, we left him behind that night. He said he had a ride. I don't know who it was. The couple on the highway, they had long insisted they saw a car like Kyle's pulled over near a lonely stretch of road. This time, pressed with modern investigative techniques, their story wavered. Dates blurred. Times shifted. But one detail stuck. A second car was there too, engine running. The box speaks, science enters the room. The evidence box became the case's heartbeat. Inside were items overlooked in the 70s, soil samples, clothing fibers, a scrap of metal believed to be from a vehicle. In 1976, none of it meant much. But now? With advanced DNA testing, chemical analysis, and microscopic imaging, every item was a potential breakthrough. A soil sample taken from the suspected dumping ground contained traces of chemical runoff consistent with a particular industrial site. Fibers lifted from Kyle's car seat matched a type of upholstery used in vehicles from the late 70s, but not his Pinto. And the metal fragment? Once dismissed as junk, it was now identified as belonging to a specific make of truck that had been registered locally at the time. What was once silence began to hum with possibility. Long-held lies start to crack. Detectives began knocking again, this time with leverage. They had science. They had patterns. And most of all, they had persistence. One aging man, who had been a peripheral suspect back in '76, had lived a quiet life since then. But when confronted with new evidence, the fibers, the timeline, the possibility of witnesses contradicting his alibi, his calm exterior fractured. You told us back then you never saw Kyle after midnight. But this says otherwise. You want to amend that statement? The man's hand trembled on the table. He muttered, I didn't want to be involved. But yeah, I saw him. He got into a truck. I don't know whose, I swear. It wasn't a confession. But it was a crack. And cracks let light in. The paper trail, documents don't lie. If human memory could fail, paperwork often told the truth. Detectives dug into old records, license registrations, work logs, receipts. One particular discovery was damning. A gas receipt from a nearby town dated the night of Kyle's disappearance, in the name of a man who had long claimed he wasn't anywhere near La Grange that evening. A handwritten logbook from a trucking company revealed one vehicle checked out late that night, and never logged back in until dawn. Each new document chipped away at old alibis. Each discovery made it harder for the guilty to hide behind time. A town forced to remember. As the reopened investigation grew legs, the community of La Grange was pulled back into a story many wished had stayed buried. Local newspapers ran fresh headlines. Families whispered again. Rumors reignited. Some were supportive, relieved the case was finally moving. Others were angry. They saw it as stirring ghosts, smearing names of men who had lived their lives since then. In reopening the case, detectives weren't just chasing justice. They were demanding a community face its own reflection, 40 years later. The breakthrough looms. By this point, detectives weren't chasing shadows anymore. They had solid leads, a suspicious truck, contradicting witness statements, and forensic evidence tying people to places they had denied being. The past was unraveling, thread by thread. And then came the discovery that changed everything, a set of documents hidden deep in the archives, travel logs, receipts, and maps, that placed one long-overlooked suspect exactly where Kyle was last seen. The lies had lasted decades. But lies don't outlive the truth. And the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. The past and present are not two separate roads, they are twin rivers, twisting side by side, eventually converging in the same dark pool of truth. To understand the suspect now, investigators had to walk the suspect's shadow back to 1975. 1975, the motive begins. The town of Brookhaven was small enough that everyone knew each other's business, or at least thought they did. But beneath the polite smiles and Sunday greetings, envy and resentment brewed. At the hardware store, a young man named Richard Hale would sweep the floor with more aggression than needed, glaring at the college kids who came in laughing, wallets fat with their parents' money. He wasn't poor, not exactly, but he wasn't them. And in that year, when jobs were scarce and futures uncertain, every reminder of what he didn't have lit another coal of bitterness inside him. That bitterness had a name. Laura Bennett. The young woman whose murder would haunt Brookhaven for decades had once laughed at Richard's jokes in high school. But by 1975, she was engaged to a man from a wealthier family. To Richard, it was betrayal, not just of him, but of the unspoken pact that small-town kids stayed loyal to small-town boys. His anger festered quietly, invisible to most. Except for the occasional slip, like the time at Murphy's Tavern, when he muttered under his breath after seeing Laura walk in with her fiancé, "She thinks she's too good for us." Present day, detectives return. In the dusty archives, the rediscovered box of evidence had reignited the case. Detective Carla Jennings sat at her desk, studying photographs from 1975. The grainy images showed Laura's last night alive, frozen in black and white, her smile at a diner booth, her car parked outside her family's house. Jennings's partner, Detective Alan Rodriguez, dropped a file onto the table. Travel logs from Hale's trucking job. Dispatch records. Look at the date, October 14, 1975. Jennings scanned the sheet. Hale had claimed he was on the road that night, out of town. But the logs showed otherwise. He wasn't dispatched until the following afternoon. His alibi had survived decades only because no one had ever double-checked the paperwork. 48 years, Jennings whispered. And this paper was sitting here the whole time. 1975, a night of lies. The night Laura disappeared, Richard told friends he'd been playing pool at the tavern until midnight. At first, no one questioned it. In those days, the tavern was crowded, smoky, filled with jukebox noise. Who remembered exactly when someone left? But one man did. Tom Willis, the bartender, recalled Hale leaving early, around 10:30. Said he had a long drive in the morning, Willis told police in his first interview. But the detail never made it into the official report. Too many witnesses, too many contradictions. It slipped through the cracks. What no one knew then was that Richard wasn't going home early. He was circling the roads near Laura's house, headlights off, waiting for her fiancé's car to pull away. Present, the interview cracks. Detectives Jennings and Rodriguez finally brought Hale in for questioning. At 67, he had aged into a quiet, unremarkable retiree. His once dark hair was silver, his hands rough with arthritis. To the neighbors, he was just another old man tending a vegetable garden. But inside the interrogation room, beneath the sterile light, the past began to seep through the cracks. Jennings slid the trucking log across the table. You told investigators back then you were out of town. But this says you weren't dispatched until the next day. Hale's jaw tightened. Maybe the paperwork was wrong. That was a long time ago. Rodriguez leaned forward. Wrong paperwork doesn't explain why your stories never changed, even after all these years. You never thought anyone would check, did you? Hale shifted, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the table. A subtle tell, but detectives had seen it before, the body betraying what the mouth refused to admit. 1975, the boiling point. The days after Laura's engagement announcement, Richard's behavior changed. Friends noticed him withdrawing, drinking more, snapping at co-workers. He became obsessed with routes Laura took home, asking casual questions about her routines. On October 14th, he followed her car after she left a study session with friends. Witnesses later recalled seeing a dark sedan tailing her down the county road. But in 1975, no one could connect it to him. Present, witness memories resurface. Rodriguez tracked down Tom Willis, the bartender, now in his 80s, living in a nursing home. His memory was frail, but some details were sharp as glass. That boy. Hale, Willis rasped. He left early that night. Said something about needing to get up early. But his eyes. I remember his eyes. Like he was wound too tight. When asked why he hadn't pressed the matter back then, Willis shook his head. Cops didn't want details, just quick answers. Small town, you know. Everyone was afraid of pointing fingers at the wrong person. The omission was damning. A detail lost in the fog of a hurried investigation had resurfaced like a body pulled from the river. Parallel tension. 1975, Richard Hale sits in his car outside Laura's house, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles bone white. The engagement ring on her finger flashes as she waves goodnight to a friend. In his mind, it's not just a ring, it's a slap in the face. Present, Hale leans back in the interrogation chair, feigning calm. But the detectives see it, the stiffness in his posture, the swallow in his throat when Laura's name is mentioned. 1975, Laura approaches her front porch, unaware of the footsteps behind her. Present, Jennings lays down the final card, a DNA report. A scrap of rope found in the evidence box, tested with modern technology, revealed skin cells. Not enough for a complete profile, but enough to exclude everyone except Richard Hale. 1975, a scream is swallowed by the night. Present, silence fills the interrogation room. Hale's tapping fingers still. His eyes fix on the file before him, and for the first time, his mask slips. The net closes. It wasn't one piece of evidence that sealed Hale's fate, it was the web. The trucking log, the bartender's memory, the rope with trace DNA, the contradictions in his story. Each strand by itself was fragile. Together, they tightened around him until there was nowhere left to hide. Jennings summarized it in her report. The suspect's lies, once protected by time and sloppy record-keeping, are now undone by persistence, memory, and science. Richard Hale has carried his secret for nearly 50 years. But the past has a way of catching up. The parallel timelines converged. What began as bitterness in 1975 ended in handcuffs in the present. And for the first time in decades, the community of Brookhaven saw the shadow lift. It was early morning when the knock came. Not the polite, neighborly kind of knock. This was firm, deliberate, the kind of knock that carried 5 decades of weight behind it. Inside, the man who had lived half his life in the shadow of a terrible secret froze. He was older now, hair gray, hands slower, the body softer with time. But his eyes still held that sharpness. The same calculating glint he'd had in 1975, when the world thought he was just another ordinary man. The officers outside didn't move. They had learned patience over the years, chasing this ghost of a case. They had waited decades for this moment, and they could wait a few more seconds. Finally, the door creaked open. Mr. ______, we need to talk. There was no fight. No dramatic chase. Just silence, and the faintest sag in his shoulders, as if he already knew this day had finally come. The weight of time. Neighbors gathered quietly as the arrest unfolded. Some whispered, some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. Him? After all these years? Children who once dared each other to visit the old crime scene were now adults with children of their own. They had grown up under the shadow of this mystery, never knowing if the killer lived among them. And here he was, being led away in handcuffs, his face pale but oddly calm. One woman clutched her chest. She had been a teenager back then, when the news first broke. She remembered candlelight vigils, the posters stapled to telephone poles, the unanswered prayers. And now she was watching the past walk into a squad car. The interrogation room. The room was stark. A metal table, 2 chairs, a recording device silently blinking red. The suspect sat slouched, his hands cuffed, eyes fixed on a corner of the wall like he was trying to disappear inside it. Detectives, younger, sharper, but carrying the weight of their predecessors, slid the old files across the table. They didn't start with accusations. They started with silence. And silence has a way of unraveling a man. At first, he deflected. I don't remember. Then, he minimized. It wasn't like that. Finally, when the evidence was laid bare, the fibers, the receipts, the DNA swab that tied him to the victim, his voice cracked. I never meant, it wasn't supposed to go that far. It was not the full truth. It was not the whole story. But it was enough. A crack in the dam that had held for 50 years. The families react. News traveled fast. Some families had waited so long they didn't even believe justice was possible anymore. Others had clung to hope like a lifeline. One victim's sister, now a grandmother, sat on her porch when the call came. She didn't cry. Not at first. She just stared out at the horizon, her hands trembling around the phone. It's over, she whispered. After all this time, it's finally over. But relief was complicated. At a press conference, reporters crowded the surviving relatives. One man spoke through clenched teeth. Why did it take 50 years? Why did my parents die never knowing the truth? Another family member, tears rolling down her face, added. Justice this late, it's not the same. It doesn't bring them back. But at least the world knows who he was. He doesn't get to hide anymore. The community confronts its ghosts. The town had lived with suspicion for decades. People had pointed fingers at neighbors, spread rumors about cover-ups, even avoided certain families. The case had poisoned trust. Now, as the suspect's name spread, there was shock, but also a strange sense of betrayal. Because he hadn't been a stranger. He had lived among them. Gone to church. Sat in diners. Shook hands at local events. He had been part of the fabric of the town. And all along, he carried a darkness no one dared imagine. Some asked if the police had failed. Others asked if the community had simply refused to see. The final words. In his last confession, he didn't offer redemption. He didn't beg for forgiveness. All he said, with a voice trembling under the weight of years, was this. I thought I got away with it. But time doesn't forget. The room was silent after that. Detectives exchanged glances, some hardened, some wary. They had closed the case, but it had taken half a century of grief, doubt, and struggle to get here. Lingering questions. As he was sentenced, there were no cheers in the courtroom. Just silence, heavy, suffocating silence. Because justice, delayed this long, never feels complete. Children grew up without mothers. Parents went to their graves without answers. Whole generations carried wounds that could not be stitched shut by a single verdict. But the arrest mattered. The confession mattered. It meant the truth had a name. And that name was no longer free to walk the streets. And in the end, as the community gathered once more, older, wiser, scarred by time, they understood something deeper. Evil can hide, but it cannot erase itself. Not forever. The courtroom was heavy with silence. Not the kind of silence born from peace, but from anticipation, from decades of unanswered questions finally clawing their way into the light. At the center of it all sat the accused, an old man now, his once sharp features softened by time, but his eyes still carrying the shadow of secrets long buried. He had lived half a century as a free man, while families mourned in fragments, their grief stretched across generations. The trial was more than a proceeding of law. It was a reckoning. The evidence in court. Prosecutors presented the re-examined evidence like pieces of a puzzle that had always been there, waiting for technology to catch up. The DNA results, the corrected timelines, the re-interviewed witnesses, all lined up now with a clarity that the 1970s had lacked. Jurors leaned forward, notebooks open, pens frozen mid-sentence as they listened. The weight of decades bore down on their deliberations. Some of them hadn't even been born when the crime took place. Others remembered it as whispers from their childhood, a neighborhood ghost story suddenly made real. The defense tried to sow doubt. Memory fades, they argued. Evidence degrades. But every word rang hollow against the undeniable truth of science and the chilling consistency of survivor testimony. The families speak. Then came the moment no one could brace for, the victims' families addressing the court. A sister, her hair now gray, her voice trembling yet unbroken. We were just kids when we lost her. Every holiday, every birthday, her absence sat at the table with us. 50 years of silence. 50 years of waiting for this day. You stole her future, and you stole ours. A son, once a toddler when his mother was taken from him, now a man with children of his own. My kids ask me why they never met their grandmother. I tell them she was taken too soon. But now I can finally tell them who did it. And I can tell them justice, no matter how late, can still come. Every word struck the room like a hammer. Even the judge's composure faltered for a moment. The verdict. When the jury returned, the air in the courtroom thickened. Guilty. The word echoed against the walls like a long-delayed answer. Families clutched each other. Tears flowed, some from relief, others from rage that it had taken half a lifetime to reach this point. The sentence, life imprisonment. For the suspect, old age meant this was a death sentence in all but name. For the families, it was something closer to acknowledgement than closure. Community reflection. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered, some with candles, some with signs bearing the victims' names. Reporters shoved microphones forward, capturing the raw emotions of a town finally seeing justice served after decades of shadows. But the conversations weren't just about the past. They were about trust, about accountability, about how many other families were still waiting in silence for their turn. Elders spoke of how the crime had reshaped the town, how fear had settled in backyards and living rooms, how suspicion had corroded friendships. Younger generations spoke of resilience, of carrying the story forward not as a wound but as a lesson. Lingering scars. Justice had arrived, but not without scars. Some family members admitted to feeling conflicted. It doesn't bring her back, one relative whispered. Another said, we're grateful, but I can't stop thinking of all the years we lost. And in that honesty, the deeper truth of the case emerged. Justice delayed is justice denied, even when the gavel finally falls. For half a century, this community carried the weight of a crime unsolved. The arrest brought answers. The trial brought accountability. But nothing, not time, not science, not the courts, can bring back the lives stolen. What remains is the memory, and the reminder, every story matters, every silence echoes, and justice must never be left to gather dust in a forgotten box. The courtroom lights dimmed, the gavel struck, and the decades-long chapter of silence finally closed. But as the echoes faded, what remained was not just the story of one victim, one family, or even one small town. It was the story of how justice, when delayed, becomes a wound that refuses to heal. 4 years, this case lived in the shadows, pushed aside by new crimes, newer tragedies, and the relentless march of time. Boxes sat unexamined. Witnesses were forgotten. Evidence was left to gather dust in basements and warehouses. And yet, even in silence, the truth never really goes away. It lingers, waiting for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to listen. This case reminds us of a painful reality. Justice in America too often depends on resources. In the 1970s, there were no DNA tests, no advanced forensic databases, no nationwide systems to track patterns across states. Detectives had their notebooks, their instincts, and the unreliable memories of frightened witnesses. They worked with what they had, but what they had simply wasn't enough. And when leads dried up, so did the urgency. For the families, however, time never dried up. Each year was another holiday with an empty chair at the table. Another birthday uncelebrated. Another reminder that the world had moved on, but their grief remained stuck in 1975. That is the true cost of inaction. Every day without answers is a day stolen, not only from the victim, but from everyone who loved them. Mothers aged into grandmothers still whispering prayers for closure. Fathers carried guilt to their graves, believing they should have done more. Siblings grew old, carrying a shadow their children never fully understood. When the forgotten evidence box was finally discovered, it wasn't just a piece of property. It was proof that the past had never really been buried, it was only ignored. Inside that dusty cardboard were voices that had been silenced, waiting to be heard. And when modern forensic science finally touched those artifacts, the truth surged forward like floodwaters breaking through a dam. This case shows us what persistence can do. A single detective refusing to let go. A family that kept pushing, even when everyone told them to stop. A new generation of investigators who understood that science could rewrite what history had failed to resolve. Without that persistence, the killer would still be walking free, his lies unchallenged, his past unchecked. But persistence alone isn't enough. Cold case breakthroughs require funding, resources, and the political will to say, these lives still matter. Every dusty box in every evidence room across America is a story unfinished. And for each one solved, there are thousands still waiting. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of families still trapped in limbo. Thousands of killers who may still be alive, free, unpunished. Thousands of towns where rumors and folklore have replaced truth. Each case is a wound in the fabric of justice. What this case teaches us is clear. When we invest in cold case units, we invest in hope. We give families a chance to breathe again, to sleep again, to finally bury their loved ones not with questions, but with dignity. It also teaches us about accountability. For decades, no one wanted to admit that evidence had been mishandled, that follow-ups weren't made, that mistakes allowed a killer to live unchallenged. And yet, when the truth came out, it wasn't just the killer who stood exposed, it was the system itself. A system too quick to move on, too underfunded to care, too willing to accept silence as resolution. This is not just about one town in 1975. It is about every unsolved case that has become a whisper in the community, a footnote in police archives, a scar in a family's heart. Cold cases are not just history, they are living pain. And solving them is not just about justice, it is about healing. Healing communities torn apart by rumors. Healing families who spent lifetimes waiting. Healing faith in a system that too often feels indifferent. The bigger picture is this: we can no longer afford to treat time as an excuse. Advances in technology have given us tools that our predecessors could only dream of. DNA databases. Digital fingerprints. Artificial intelligence combing through old files for new connections. These are not luxuries, they are necessities. Because every unsolved case is a test of our values. Do we believe every life matters? Or only the ones convenient enough to solve? Do we believe justice has an expiration date? Or do we believe it should stretch as far as persistence will take it? In this case, justice finally came, but only because someone refused to stop asking. Someone refused to let the victim's name become just another rumor whispered in the dark. And so the lesson is passed on to us. For every cold case that still lingers, for every mother still waiting for that knock at the door, for every dusty box that might contain the key, this story demands we ask, what will we do about it? Because justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice waiting, waiting for us to care enough to finish what others started. And somewhere out there, another family is still waiting. Another name is still lost in silence. Another killer still walks free. The bigger picture is not just this one story, it is all the stories we have yet to tell. And until we tell them, the work is not done. The gavel struck one last time, echoing through the courthouse like a closing chapter. Reporters rushed out to meet their deadlines, while family members clutched photographs of their loved ones, some crying, others simply staring blankly, relieved, but forever marked. For the community, the decades-long mystery had finally ended. But in the quiet of a dimly lit evidence room, another story was already beginning. A detective, new to the cold case division, fresh-faced but carrying the weight of curiosity, stayed behind after hours. The air smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of room where history lingered, where justice still waited its turn. He traced his fingers along the rows of battered boxes, each one stamped with years long past, 1978, 1982, 1991. Each box a silent witness. Each box a cry that had gone unheard. Then, one caught his eye. It wasn't large. It wasn't even properly labeled. Just a faded tag with a number and a single word, scrawled in pen, unsolved. He slid it off the shelf and placed it gently on the table. Inside, the smell of time escaped, a cocktail of mildew, old photographs, and forgotten paper. He pulled out a file. A name leapt from the cover. Another victim. Another life cut short. Another Washington family who had buried their daughter without answers. The detective flipped through photographs of the crime scene, grainy images of a wooded area, a half-burnt car, a necklace lying in the dirt. He read the faded statements from witnesses, children then, grown adults now. And just like that, he felt the same pull that had drawn generations of investigators before him. Something about the details didn't add up. Something about the timeline felt familiar. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the board where the now-closed case files sat neatly stacked. Then he glanced back down at the fresh file in his hands. The resemblance was undeniable. 2 young women. Similar ages. Similar circumstances. Similar gaps in the investigation. A chill ran down his spine. For decades, everyone had believed the 2 cases were separate tragedies, isolated, unrelated. But looking at the evidence now, with fresh eyes and modern tools, a darker possibility began to form. What if they weren't separate at all? What if they were connected? He pressed the file shut, heart pounding, and walked out of the room, the box tucked under his arm. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one pulling him deeper into a mystery that had been buried for nearly half a century. As he reached the exit, he glanced back at the rows of untouched boxes. Hundreds of stories. Hundreds of families still waiting. And in that moment, he knew, this was only the beginning. One case closed does not erase the silence of countless others. In the shadows of justice, there are still files collecting dust, still names without answers, still voices that refuse to be forgotten. And in Washington state, another cold case is stirring, one with haunting similarities that could unravel everything we thought we knew. The truth is never buried forever. Sometimes, it waits for the right pair of eyes to finally see it.